Hi, wherever you are listening to Ideas Untrapped Podcast, where we talk to experts, scholars, and other social thinkers on ideas that can bring prosperity to some of the poorer regions in the world today. Happy New Year to you, wherever you're listening to us from around the world. And welcome to another episode of Ideas Untrapped Podcast. This is the first episode of the year, and we hope you've had a very long and nice holiday. On today's episode, I speak with Oliver Harman about global value chains, foreign direct investments, and regional governance in economic development. Oliver and I discussed how global value chains have evolved, the crucial role of multinational enterprises in knowledge transfer, and why regional governments, rather than national ones, are often better positioned to shape policies that maximize the benefits from global trade. The conversation highlights the importance of global value chain sensitive policies, investment promotion agencies, and upgrading strategies to help economies move up the value chain and develop. Oliver Harman is an economist. He specializes in spatial economics and economic geography. He's a senior policy economist for the International Growth Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's also a research associate at the Blavatsky School of Government at the University of Oxford. I thank him for joining me on this episode, and I want to thank you, the listener, for always tuning in. In harmony, echoes of progress. Welcome, Oliver, to Ideas Untrapped Podcast. It's wonderful to have you here. And I have to say that your work, along with Riccardo Crescenzi, is one of the most refreshing things that I've read, certainly in the last couple of years, on global value chains. It's a wonderful book. I'll put up links to how people can access it in the show notes. And it's something that I think everybody should read. So I want to start with these very basic ideas because we know that global value chain as a topic of discourse or just as a phrase is very much in the zeitgeist generally, even if we're talking about what is going on geopolitically. But what essentially are global value chains? How would you describe that phrase?
Thank you for having me on, Tobi. And thank you very much for your kind comments on the book. It is much appreciated. One thing I will say actually is I can provide with you a little open access overview of the book just for some of your listeners. So in case they're not quite willing to make the ebook purchase, they can get a little flavor of it. So I'm going to do that. I think it'd be useful to receive. But as to your question, I think it's worth just orientating our ideas on what are global value chains and a little bit how they've risen to where they are today. I'll try and make it brief, but I'll try and use some examples. Global value chains, as a concept, really sort of expanded primarily academically since the 2000s. I mean, before the millennium, there was very little in the kind of academic literature, and now it's blown up quite a lot. There was less of this in the policy discourse. We didn't quite see, so I'm comparing information from Google Ngram to where it was in the policy discourse, and they weren't chiming so well. So that's where this book came from. Now, to the question of what is a global value chain itself, the way that we like to sort of explain this, and I think it's most useful, is economists used to always talk about this classic trade between England and France, where England would make cloth and France would make wine, and we would trade with each other these final goods. These were kind of the two final goods that each country would have its competitive advantage in. And where the global value chain comes in is when you break down these final goods into a lot of their intermediate parts. And indeed, from the 1990s, 2000 I mentioned earlier, we saw this fragmentation of trade along those parts. And the way we like to conceptualize this is instead of thinking about trading cloth and wine, we think about the bicycle. The bicycle has become sort of a poster child of global value chains. And it's this trade in intermediate goods. So the bicycle, we often think it as one good, but actually there's this Canadian photographer who took apart all of its parts, and it's 571 intermediate goods. And those are both researched and designed, they're produced, they're packaged, they're marketed in different regions around the world and traded with each other in different regions around the world. So it's been this sort of concept and indeed this reality that's completely reframed the way that we think about trade. I mean, the other example is the iPhone or the Samsung. The Samsung phone, we typically think about it as one thing, but I think it's like 2,800 parts I was reading in it. And this is not just Samsung, it's all the firms and all the intermediaries that come together to produce that phone, which is the kind of global value chain as we see it today.
Oh, yeah. So how would you then say they have evolved over time, decades, to where they are? What are the major milestones or events that have shaped how global value chains were, say, 20, 30 years ago and where they are today?
I think it's a good question, indeed, because there have been these different stages and changes within these global value chains, which mean that we sort of have to think about them and react to them in slightly different ways. So, of course, the academic literature I spoke about earlier, it was somewhat behind the reality. So it was the 1990s that we saw this boom in global value chains as trade became more fragmented, as we said it. So the different parts of the bicycle, rather than all being made in Japan, for example, with Shimano, yes, as I said, they were all made in different parts around the world and more discrete, smaller goods being traded with each other. So there was this real boom up until the kind of mid 2000s, and indeed a lot of people were benefiting from this increase in global value chain participation. I think almost every industry saw an increase in global value chain participation. And it reached about, depending on how you measure, kind of 40 or 50% of trade was through global value chains. Then in the financial crisis, what happened is we saw this plateauing. I think there was a little bit of a restructuring of the global economy, as we or other scholars well discuss. And we've seen this rise somewhat plateau at this sort of 40%, 50% level, depending on how you define it. And so global value chains are still core to the global economy, but they sort of haven't quite been rising to the same extent. Indeed, one of the messages in this book, it's even more crucial to find the right global value chain for your economic development trajectory, because you no longer can just ride on the coattails of this increasing trade. You have to sort of be a little bit more targeted. Yeah, one of the key messages of the book is sort of all global value chains are different and all regions are different to global value chains. So making sure you build that connection succinctly is important.
There are three things that are sort of key or central to the research that you summarized in the book. One of them are multinational enterprises, then foreign direct investment, and you focus a lot more on regional governance generally. To discuss the first one, which are multinational enterprises, is of particular relevance to me as a Nigerian because for one, we've seen a lot of multinational companies depart the country in the last 6-7 years. And the general attitude, well, not the general attitude, but the attitude of some people, either in government or advocates of the government or general, like, well, so what? There are local investors who can replace those people who left. It's not really a big deal, this or that. But can you elaborate for me the governance role, which you discussed quite extensively in the book, the governance roles that multinational enterprises play within global value chains?
Yes, absolutely. I think the reason why we focus on multinationals is because indeed ourselves and a lot of the literature points to them as the governing arm of global value chains. Global value chains can be seen as this quite ambiguous, untangible sort of concept unless you really place it with who's actually controlling them and what are people doing within them. And that's where multinationals, or lead firms, as other people call them, they are leading the firm in certain ways. That's another thing we like to kind of talk about and I think is important for regional policymakers is to engage with these multinationals, is to think about what are they doing within your region and how can they be of increased benefit to your region, or at least how can they be less extractive. There's a big dialogue in economics and economic geography about, big firms versus small firms. What are the ones that you want? And indeed, as you can imagine from someone in my position who's writing on harnessing global value chains, there is an important role for big firms with respect to knowledge transfer. These big firms have with them knowledge and capacity that's often close to the technological frontier. It's often really pushing the boundaries of what we know. And when regions and indeed countries such as Nigeria engaging with these multinationals, they can bring this knowledge from all of their other subsidiaries around the world. And I think this is quite important, particularly for lower income or emerging market countries. It's a quick way to catch up with the technological frontier. Because if you have the right policy, this kind of knowledge can quickly filter down to local actors, to the local supply chain, to smaller firms who can upgrade, which we'll get onto later, and who can use and engage with this knowledge to kind of further themselves and develop. And this is not something that's some arbitrary concept. This is very much true, particularly in the African context. I've done some analysis looking at the global value chain integration across the world while he's taken the data from it. And you can see, African countries are quite engaged in global value chains. Of course, not quite as engaged as Europe. These are still things that are affecting African countries and have a huge merit for their potential development. And if they're not engaged with properly, it could be a potential kind of demerit, because of course multinationals can be extractive, they can be profiteering if they're not kind of engaged with properly. But then all firms can do in that sense.
So how can governments, policymakers, how can they structure the governance around their relationship with multinational enterprises so that they can really deliver the value enhancements, I should say, on global value chains? And are those policies really different from, general economic or macroeconomic policies, stability, exchange rate, and all these things?
Yeah, that's a good question. One that we make the case for, and it's an empirically grounded case, and there has been lots of success in the past of other countries doing this, but we call for what we call kind of global value chain sensitive policies. So these are policies that explicitly and implicitly think about their consequences for global value chain interaction. And I think it's worthwhile maybe talking about a couple of these for examples. So there are kind of the ones that reach up to the global value chain and engage with it quite directly. Something, for example, that's had quite good success are investment promotion agencies. These are good ways in which local policymakers in particular, and national policymakers as well, can think about the sort of multinationals and the sort of investment they want to get in their locality, and think about, okay, what is it we want to bring? And also, what are our kind of local socioeconomic circumstances that we think are attractive to multinationals? Whether that be skills, whether that be certain types of infrastructure, finding that right multinational to come and touch down and engage with that area is quite an important way. There's shown to be quite a lot of success with how these work, particularly at a subnational level. There's good evidence, particularly in Europe, but I think it expands for the rest of the world. The people of Lagos probably know what Lagos is best at doing and what kind of investment they would want to bring better than the national government, who might not have that same connection or the same kind of information. And indeed, the sort of evidence does point to these sort of subnational investment promotion agencies are particularly powerful. So that's kind of on the reaching up to the global value chain. But there's also the sort of setting the ground to allow the global value chain to kind of drop, to use some metaphor, a little bit more effectively. And these are the sort of more horizontal policies that work. So I think there's useful ones around thinking the sort of skills training and management that you might want to harness and deliver to your local population. Of course, that sounds like a normal policy, but when you think about it in a global value chain sensitive way, you can discuss with the kind of multinationals that are already in your area or you might want to attract, and kind of think, okay, what are the sorts of skills that these lead firms are looking for, and how can we maybe adapt our training, our human capital, our education system to align a little bit closer to those. And indeed, there's good evidence. We talk to it in the books. For example, in Indonesia, there's this Penang skill center that is often cited where they did exactly that. They kind of spoke to a lot of the multinationals in the area and managed to retrain people in kind of higher education to provide the skills that were a little bit more sought after by these firms, and ultimately had quite large developmental consequences as a result. So this kind of global value chain sensitive policy is really something we think is under discussed and under provided in policy circles. And it seems those regions who are doing cases of this are really seeing merit as a consequence.
And of course, multinationals are an expression of foreign direct investment generally, which is the next key thing you focused on in the book. We know that some countries have managed to use FDI effectively to really develop their economies. Malaysia, Poland, Bangladesh to an extent, Vietnam. Is there a particular generalized pattern or lesson that can be drawn, particularly on the linkages between FDI, global value chain, regional governments, that then creates this sweet spot, to develop broadly?
Yeah. So, I'm always careful with general lessons, but I do think one thing that is a kind of a core takeaway, and something that I do think a lot of the book and the literature speaks to, is the quality of FDI rather than the quantity of FDI. That's really quite key. People often look at the amount of finances that's coming in, but when you ask that sort of so what question, it often falls down. And so I think that links a little bit to what I was talking about, a global value chain sensitive policy and the process of upgrading, which we haven't quite spoken about, but I think it's worth just touching upon. Yeah. Upgrading is another kind of core concept that comes through this book, which is moving firms, countries or regions into sort of higher value activities in the global value chain. There's a great diagram or metaphor that we use, the smile curve. So thinking about what are the greater value added activities. For example, production is one thing, but research and development is a lot higher valued activity. You could have hundreds of millions in production related FDI, but those are going to be typically lower value added activities and of a different development trajectory than maybe $10 million of research and development FDI. And even more so if that kind of research and development FDI takes you on a different trajectory, or is indeed better for the region itself, because we sometimes see FDI locking in these kind of development trajectories that might not transform economies in the same way. So making sure that we're thinking about that so what question, what is that FDI doing and what is the quality associated with it, rather than just thinking about these aggregate numbers. Because as I said at the beginning, this global value chains, we're having this sort of plateau post the financial crisis. And indeed, there's been another little reorientation after the pandemic. And although they seem to have held quite steady, but still, there was quite a bit of a shock to the global value chains, as you can imagine. So it's about even more so thinking about what is the right FDI for your locality. And a big message of this book that I've sort of touched upon is making sure that happens at a subnational level. Because often aggregated national government doesn't know as well as the sort of subnational government what is right for that economy and that kind of socioeconomic circumstances of that area.
I agree with you on upgrading. I was going to get to that particular question. I had Eric Verhoeven on the show last year. The story of upgrading is something that I find personally very fascinating, whether it is Hyundai being a cement manufacturer 50 years ago and how it moved to construction, to shipbuilding and automobile, or a Japanese salt-making company that is today one of the most highly placed companies in the microchips value chain. And this is as much true for individual companies as it is for countries. We know that countries like Bangladesh have struggled upgrading away from garment or textile manufacturing, and Vietnam has had a little bit more success. So on the upgrading question, generally, what are the effective strategies? Because I think generally regions or subnational governments or places, you can always find one thing that they are good at or that they are doing. The problem is getting stuck with that thing for a very, very long time. So I guess the whole point, even the relevance of GVCs in this context, is upgrading. So what are I know you shy away from general lessons, but what are the effective strategies, that you can deploy practically to reap the benefits of upgrading?
No, I'm happy to have my arm gently twisted and go into general lessons for you, Toby, of course. I think it's worth just, again, for myself and your listeners, just to touch upon upgrading and maybe give an example of it, because I think you've given some useful ones. Again, I think returning to this bicycle and thinking about the kind of different types of upgrading within there, upgrading can be moving from producing bicycle brakes to designing bicycle brakes. That's sort of the higher value activity. Or indeed, we kind of thinking about the new green transition, it can be kind of moving from producing bicycle brakes to producing electric bicycle brakes. That's also, again, an increased value added activity. And I think actually, particularly, a lot of my work is on, I work with a number of countries across Africa on global value chains and urban economics more generally. And I think actually upgrading can be a useful complementary development pathway to sort of structural transformation, because I think it provides countries a way and regions a way to stay within their core competencies, to stay within their comparative advantage, but to keep on finding more value added additions within that. If you're a country that does a lot with forestry, rather than moving entirely away from forestry, thinking about how you can move from just cutting down the trees and then having that processed elsewhere, to think about, okay, what can we do with light processing within our locality that's going to bring these higher value added activities? To go to your question, these effective strategies for upgrading, they are, of course, going to, or maybe not of course, but they are going to be all different for different regions. And I think that's where the importance of global value chain mapping comes in. And global value chain mapping is a process that we advocate for, different governance areas, which both looks at what are they doing at the moment, thinking about, okay, we have a comparative advantage in forestry. This is where we seem to be engaged with quite a lot of global value chains. Okay, who are those multinationals that we are exporting with? Where are these products going? What kind of activities are we working on? Okay, well, excellent. Let's think about the kind of additional value added activities that we can do and the types of multinationals and the types of chains who are involved in those activities. So there's that kind of looking outward to the chain, and as well as looking inward as well. So as a region, okay, we have this comparative advantage in forestry because of our geography, because of our climate. But what are these other things that we have that can also be potential new value chains to engage in? And so the mapping is an important strategy. And then we think about these sort of three different trajectories that you can go. There's sort of upgrading through building global value chains. So this is new global value chains, which is a little bit about that kind of new forestry types of processes that you might want. You might want to look at some FDI to provide a new factory in order to do that. Then there's the kind of embedding side of things. So how can we actually really entrench these activities and really make them more central to our economic structure and our development? And then there's the final one, which is sort of upgrading through reshaping value chains. So this might be, as we kind of touched upon earlier, and as you were indicating, when a value chain almost gets to the end of its useful life, or indeed just the global economy moves on, how can we change our existing activities in a way that sort of moves with this? And I think that reshaping is important, and that's where, particularly as I was kind of indicating, things like these investment promotion agencies can help, because they can help a region think about the next stage of their development trajectory, because the jobs and activities of today are probably not going to be the jobs and activities of tomorrow, and the value chains shift and shape, and I think regions need to be adapted to that reality.
One way that your work is sort of different from, I don't know, the general tone of maybe development economics and research, is that there's a lot more focus on regional governments, or should I say subnational governments, as the locus of policy making and, strategy. What informed that particular choice? Is it because it just keeps things simple? So I'll give you one recent example. I don't know if you have heard it in the news. Recently, a state here in Nigeria, quite close to Lagos State here, Ogun State, entered into an agreement with a Chinese firm about an industrial zone. Bottom line, there was some contractual dispute, and the Chinese investors eventually got an international court judgment that led to them seizing the presidential jet. Right.
Wow.
And consequently, there have been calls for some form of oversight from the national government on the kind of policies or agreements that state governments get themselves into, because that particular episode was embarrassing for the government, as one can imagine, which then affects the autonomy of some of these local and state governments and their flexibility and ability to pursue certain policies. So again, what sort of informed this choice of focus on regional governments as opposed to national governments?
No, it's a good question. I think it was probably informed by two parts, right? We felt the global value chain literature was a little bit aspatial and lacking a geographical, maybe not lacking, but at least under-providing a geographical lens and a geographical side of these sort of things. All global value chains touch down somewhere in a country, and thus it's important to sort of know where they are and what can be done about them when they are touching down through these sort of factories, through these production hubs, through these services and the like. So I think that was a little bit of that sort of importance that we felt on a purely useful level. This is where I think the literature could be most useful. Otherwise, a lot of people just use these kind of trade flows moving in and out of the country. What is the imports? What is the exports? But this lack of geography was really quite apparent. And we felt it was quite apparent. And also, as I kind of indicated, it was quite underprovided. You kind of spoke about different actors in your anecdote then. You had your sort of supranational governance actors, which there has been quite a lot of discussion on with global value chains. And of course, the national side of things as well. then when you just use the national actors, you miss a lot of this variation that is quite important for GVCs. For example, what matters for a GVC or for the kind of firms involved in global value chains in a port city might be very different from what matters for firms involved in global value chains in the capital city. The port city might be exporting quite heavy labor intensive goods, but then the kind of firms involved in the global value chain in the capital city might actually be exporting kind of digital services. And if you just think about these policies at a national level, you miss out a lot of that variation. And I think as a result, you miss out how each city or each region can really use global value chains to their own merit, because everything kind of gets aggregated. So I think that was why we also thought it was quite important to bring in this subnational actor to the story a little bit more.
Let me just detour a little bit. Speaking of economic geography, right? Let me ask you a silly question. Maybe not silly, but you might consider it silly anyways. So what is the distinction between geography? This is all in the context of development anyways. Geography in the sense of direct diamond, long history type of thing, the climate 300 years ago or the quality of soil 500 years ago as determinants of economic structures and patterns today, and economic geography, I mean, in the sense of your work, or maybe as popularized by people like Krugman and co. What's the difference or the distinction?
That is a good question, and would probably require another book in and of itself, right? No, I do. I think the way I would probably try and answer it is thinking about sort of the different types of capital that end up getting somewhat deployed in these different areas, right? The geography, just you're thinking a lot more about the sort of the physical capital of those areas, as you kind of touched upon the different soil types, the climate. These are very sort of first principle benefits and detriments of an area. I think the economic geography brings in these other capitals a little bit more, the sort of the human capital side of things, your sort of investment capital, these other elements that can shape regions on different development pathways beyond just these sort of physical geographical consequences. Of course, this is quite a grey area and there are overlaps on some of these areas, but I think that would be how I would try and distinguish them. Once you add these different types of sort of human capital and different investment capital and the like, you can push areas on different regional development pathways. At the moment, I'm writing about pear production and export in Argentina. There's an area in Argentina that, in terms of its geography, it has the perfect climate for certain fruit types, and it has the perfect sort of irrigation basin for the amount of water that pears and pear-like fruits would want. But then in addition to that, there was a lot of investment in things like canals and in things like irrigation that was necessary to move that beneficial geography into something that had a beneficial sort of economic geography. That really has changed this area in Brazil to like being one of the highly specialized pear producing area, which otherwise it might not have necessarily known. And this brings me onto one of the other key messages of the book in a nutshell that I'll share, which is talking about this fine-grained specialization is necessary. It was only with the additional capital being added to this area that it allowed to find this kind of fine-grained specialization in pear export. And as a result, this area is now, very successful because it's found this niche and is exporting pears all around the world. But its problem is, how does it upgrade? Because it's very good at exporting pears, but those sort of value-added activities that I spoke about earlier, maybe the processing of pears or even the marketing of tinned pears, for example, those are also activities that you might want to be associated with your region that are all part of that global value chain. So they're sort of in one of these, they're not necessarily stuck, but they're having to reshape their development trajectory in a way to do some of these other activities that require some of these other types of capital to do so.
Let me ask you another silly question, and I'm appealing to the urban economist in you now.
Okay.
In 2009 or thereabout, so you might dodge this question perhaps because it requires a judgment call on your hand. In 2009 or thereabout, Paul Roma made this splash with a TED Talk on charter cities. So before going into the weeds of that, would you say that that particular moment in the spotlight, I mean, knowing what we know now, has it been helpful or harmful to urban economics generally, especially in relatively poor countries? Because the whole charter city idea and the movement it spawned hasn't really turned out so well. The latest episode being the Prospera case in Honduras, which has also blown into a huge lawsuit.
Okay. No, I think I will try and answer your question, but sort of thinking about the global value chain framework and indeed what I just said. I'm, of course, well apprised of the Charter City movement and have some friends who are involved in the Charter City movement as well. But I think to return to what we were discussing in terms of the first principles, the first geographical sort of physical capital of an area or your geographical capital of an area and what you add on it, I think it's interesting to think about where charter cities are placed where they are. And as a consequence, what are the kinds of other capital that need to be added onto them to push them down on certain development pathways in a sense. By their very nature, they exist where a city has not existed before.
Okay.
And there is some reason, there is some rationale where maybe a city has not born organically in a certain area. And so I think that's the interesting question that we have to consider is what are the other capitals, the other types of infrastructure and the like that are needed in order to make these cities a success, because there is some market forces, some rationale as to why they haven't existed there before. And as a result, they have more to overcome in that sense than developing an existing city and kind of trying to deal with the ills or difficulties of an existing city, because these existing cities are already there because they have some first geographical merit of being a city there. You know, they're by a port, they're by a waterway, they have some proximity to some agricultural basin or something like that. And I think that's where the sort of global value chain framework and thinking about its use for regional development can be beneficial to the charter city movement. It's like, okay, without these first geographical merits, what is it that you are going to produce? What is going to be the economic dynamism of that area? What are the kind of local fundamentals, these socioeconomic characteristics that we can map that can give us an idea for the direction of this kind of local economy? The cities weren't there for a reason initially, so you've got to have a pretty good reason to put them there.
So how would you think about charter city itself or the concept itself as an idea? Maybe I feel strongly because I was an early adopter and an enthusiast, and I've grown quite so distant from that idea and community lately, largely because I think there have been more successful charter city startups and think tanks than actual charter cities. And I'm not sure how useful it is. And the core of my skepticism is like it's sort of an idea that needs to thrive basically on giving up on existing cities. Like you have people that are committed to ideas of making cities work, except actually existing cities, right? And I don't know how viable it is to start a new city from the scratch up and make it work and have this economy of scale. And maybe I'm imputing too much of my bias into this. So what are your thoughts on charter cities generally? Because it's something that I would say the professional urban economics research side has been relatively silent on, whereas the charter city ecosystem borrows a lot from urban economic ideas. Yeah, so that's my question, if I make sense.
Yes, it does make sense. I think in my experience, now let me say one thing before I do that. I think with a lot of like new exciting ideas, it's important that we understand the whole picture as what's going on so we can both measure success and measure failure well. And the Charter City movements reminds me of some of the literature around clusters and the development of clusters. The issues with understanding what was successful and not successful with clusters was that you would only ever hear about the successful clusters that formed. There was not often much counterfactual around the unsuccessful clusters because they just didn't exist, because they were unsuccessful by their very nature. So the whole way that we would, as scholars, kind of understand what works and what didn't work was biased by the sense that we were only really learning from success because we didn't see the whole picture of what was necessarily going on, and we couldn't necessarily learn from failure in the same way. And I think that's just the nature of, we call it kind of an n equals 1 problem, in that there's only n equals 1. There's either the city or there isn't the city. There's either the cluster or there isn't the cluster. And sometimes understanding that trajectory towards that either being in existence or not in existence is quite tricky. So I do think I understand it's quite a hot topic, but I do think as researchers, we need to do better at not just sort of cherry picking positive success cases, which might be in that top 1%, might be in that top 10% where everything works, and instead have a much better broad-based view of what is going on in this space. And indeed, I think the literature on clustering and kind of beneficial clusters, we can learn from that, because it didn't necessarily fail in that part, but I think it was one of the issues that I think as a researcher community, we look back on and think, okay, our case selection wasn't necessarily unbiased in that sense. So I kind of wanted to say that from the top. I think there's like an interesting definitional difficulty with some of these things as well, because some people would think of like special economic zones as being some quasi charter city. Indeed, a lot of what we talk about in this work, in this book, and kind of upcoming work thinking about the greening of global value chains, talks about how actually beneficial industrial parks can be, and particularly like eco-industrial parks for kind of building some local economic development. Now, an eco-industrial park has some similar characteristics to a charter city, but is definitely not a charter city. So I think there are some measures of success that can be drawn from when thinking about what you can create out of not necessarily nothing, but what you can create out of something that wasn't there before. But I do think we need to be careful about, going back to my first point, sort of what are those economic fundamentals upon which we're building it upon? And as you say, why are we not just expanding the city where there already is some kind of economic rationale for it being there? What is that kind of trade-off in creating something new? And if it is just a question of governance, why aren't we trying to fix the governance side that already exists within these kind of existing frameworks? Those are my thoughts. I'm hesitant to be drawn into a good or bad thing because I just don't think we've been measuring it sufficiently well to really have a good view. And I wouldn't be able to tell you all the cases where it hasn't been successful just because they have not been documented. So I think we are overly biased and optimistic as a result because we see the ones that work.
Fair enough. One thing that has often been identified and repeated over the years, particularly on urbanization in places like Africa, is that the population is urbanizing at a historically lower income than other regions of the world. Poor urbanization, as some researchers have called it. And part of the key problem why this is the low level of manufacturing jobs, or the penetration of tradable sectors generally as opposed to informal service sector jobs in those cities. So looking at your work, particularly on global value chains, are you optimistic that via GVCs, it might not just be time to give up on manufacturing yet, as someone like Roderick is now saying?
Yes. So I do think, I agree. The evidence is quite clear, right? African cities or African countries are urbanizing at dramatically lower levels than others. And I do think this has consequences for how we think about development trajectories. Is a little bit upon what I spoke about earlier with respect to structural transformation. And this story of going from agriculture to manufacturing to services is not one that I think as a development pathway we can consider in the same way. And upgrading has to be more central to this. We have to think about ways in which we can look at moving from agriculture and upgrading into agro-processing as kind of an additional side of things. Or the different sides of upgrading within manufacturing. We might want to move from production of certain goods to a higher value-added logistics and purchase of certain goods. And I think this is something that's lacking a little bit in the policy discourse. For example, I spoke about earlier how a lot of African countries are very much integrated into sort of global value chains, but actually a lot of the trade blocs as well are increasingly participating in global value chains. So like the East African Community, some of the West African kind of trading communities, they're all seeing since 1990, where there was this big boom, to 2015, they're all increasing their participation in global value chains at a little bit of a slower rate than some of the Asian trading blocs, but still very much the case. And this is across all sectors. I have some colleagues, Anna Twom and a co-author De Mello, have a paper looking at particularly the East African community, and every single sector is increasing its participation in global value chains. So this is really rising, and it really has huge potential consequences for a lot of the African countries, I believe. And I think particularly we're at the kind of African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I know there's a lot of conversations around how to build both regional value chains and global value chains. And indeed, sort of as you kind of mentioned, some of the Roderick, bringing back some of this industrial policy, or as we would argue, global value chain sensitive policy, to do this, to start moving the global value chains for this kind of regional enhancement. And this is a couple of the aims, I know, of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, to sort of enhance competitiveness via both diversification and regional value chain development. So I think I see it as, an important tool, not without their consequences, because of course you can get this wrong. And rather than upgrading, you can get downgrading, for example, where the multinational might take all of the merit and value. But that's why I think having that engagement and that connectivity is important. I think the first key message of this book is connectivity is key. So having that connection with the value chain and its multinational is important. I think Africa as a continent is at an interesting time for this. But with these interesting new constraints, a lot of the world has managed to offshore its labor-intensive tasks to other lower-income countries. And now we are reaching the stage where Africa is both urbanizing and some of the lowest-income countries. So they don't quite have that same ability to offshore jobs in the way that other countries have done so, which makes understanding where the value is within their value chains even more important through those things we've spoken about earlier, such as global value chain mapping and thinking about how to reshape the economic fundamentals.
How can regional governments at different levels of decision making set themselves up to get useful data and use that to influence policy making?
This is an important point, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I think the data question is often key, right? And I think it's often one that's, particularly in some of these lower income contexts in the African continent and more broadly, is sometimes lacking. I mean, one way is this global value chain mapping exercise that I spoke about earlier, that does allow subnational governments or national governments to get their own data and own understanding of this, and being able to understand the local consequences is useful. But also there are some great global data sets that are starting to disaggregate their data by geography in a much more useful way. So inter-country input-output tables, for example, I think that's by the World Bank, or at least, no, it's not the World Bank, but it's another kind of world organizations. They're very useful and are beginning to get disaggregated. And similarly, the sort of OECD's trade and value added, that's thinking about where the value added is along these different tradable goods, both at the intermediate good level and the final good level, is really useful. And I think there's more and more researchers crowding into this space, trying to understand exactly where along the value chain these value can be brought. And even more so, kind of firm to firm data, I think, is really useful to help paint this sort of empirical picture. They all provide really quite useful insight. So I think it's important to begin to geographically disaggregate these sort of national data sets, because what can be good for one region or locality might be very different to another. And I think without the data available for some of these things, a lot of policymakers and governments are flying a little bit blind in that sense. But no, it's an issue, but it's definitely something there's exciting change in, that's sort of being rectified by academics. But of course, academics doing it slower than anyone would want otherwise.
So what is that one idea? It may be your idea, maybe someone else's, maybe something you're working on. But what is that one idea that you would like to see spread everywhere, that you like to see become more influential, that you like to see more people adopt or believe in? What is that one idea?
That's nice. I think the one thing that will often get me heated around the dinner table with my mum in mild argument is this sort of idea around either the globalization of trade or the localization of trade. My lovely mother has this desire that, everything as much as possible to be made in Britain. Why aren't things being made in Britain? And I'm going, well, Mum, exactly the point of this book and, my work is that different areas have different comparative advantages. There's a reason why we don't grow bananas in Britain, right? Because we just don't have the climate for it. There are other places that do that much more successfully. And there are these gains from trade from everyone sort of cooperating a little bit more on their own merit rather than competing and trying to kind of get to the top. So I think particularly after the pandemic, there does seem to be this rationale of we want to produce everything within our own borders. But actually, both economically and environmentally, this is of detriment to the globe. If we want to produce bananas in Britain, then we're going to be using a lot of energy to do so. And we haven't fully, decarbonized our grid. And it's much more effective, to ship those over. And shipping is an incredibly low emissions way of transporting goods. So I think that's sort of my one idea. I think we're losing it a little bit at the moment. I feel in both conversations with my mum and in kind of policy circles, indeed, people are wanting to produce a lot more on their own, within their own national boundaries, but forgetting there are these sort of gains from trade and these gains from different areas having their micro specialisms, doing what they do best, and then sharing that with others. And I think if we all understood that a little bit better, there would be kind of a net global benefit. But right now, the kind of politics seems to be overtaking the policy.
That's a fantastic idea. I hope everything gets back to normal soon and we are not, stuck in this mercantilist crap or moment. What is going through right now. So thank you very much, Oliver, for being part of Ideas Untrapped. It's been fantastic talking to you.
No, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate, you both taking time out to have this conversation and indeed read the book. No, it's a great pleasure to be able to share this long laboured after work. So I appreciate your time and appreciate your listeners' time as well.
For updates on new episodes, our blogs, our meetups, and so many other interesting things that we are up to, you can simply check out our website, www.ideasuntrapped.com. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcast updates.
In harmony with